So you get this in characters like Tius, when he's remembering his sister and how they took his sister away in the white car. And this is the forced adoption principles that came on the heels of the Indian Act and all that kind of stuff, right? And so this is a lived experience of Tius, and he's wondering, he's nostalgic for his sister. What would it be like to have a family? But instead, he's taken out and displaced into a different family where there's, abuse of various kinds, and he's lamenting this with Jonny, as Jonny laments his own missing father and so forth. That these problems of abuse and violence and sexual misconduct, rape, etc., alcoholism, all the problems, can be attributed largely to these policies enacted by the government. And part of this homecoming is for Indigenous culture to reimagine its history, to confront its history in its reality, and to forge a new way forward. And this is what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is all about. And so towards the end of the novel, we see elements of this coming out. So this is page 205. Well, I'll just mention that, nostalgia is mentioned on page 200. It says, "We held each other for what seemed a lifetime after that. We were so fucking helpless in our nostalgia, both so heavy with our sadness. When you really let yourself feel, well, you end up scaring yourself from all the hurt and pain." Okay. So on page 205, we get Jonny's back on the reservation, and he talks to his mother, and he says, "I had this dream about you one night, My mom said as she pulled me toward the couch and we sat down." So this is the mother talking to Jonny. "After your Kokum, grandmother, died, that woman, always having her own crazy-ass dreams, but she told me I'd have one about you one day." So this idea of, moving into the dream world, into the spirit world, to imagine alternative futures, imagine alternative realities. This is, the area of imagination that we're entering into. Mom continues, "Told me I had to tell you about it when I did. We're standing on this riverbed, you and me, and it's lined with all these big-ass native men in regalia. They're spearfishing in this murky river," right? So I just love this moment, that she has this dream of her son as the big-ass native man in regalia, right? That it's both a stereotype, but it's also a prophetic vision. And, as I've said in other videos, Indigenous literature is often really hilarious. And I just love the way that she uses this language, big-ass native men in regalia, because it just, it forces home the way in which these stereotypes exist for even Indigenous people themselves, to say, look, this is how we have to talk because we don't have our own history. And then it's all about, Jonny showing a new way, but he's not the big-ass man, native man in regalia, right? He's totally different, he's the full metal indigiqueer, to borrow, Whitehead's other title from his other book, right? That this is a different kind of Indian. This is not your stereotypical person in regalia. And he's out there showing them how to spearfish, that he's showing the new way forward. Yes, there are other traditions. It's not to say the traditions are bad or we shouldn't learn them, but there are other ways to use these traditions in new forms. And Jonny's out there spearfishing, right? Showing them how it's done. Okay. So a little bit later in the text, it talks about Jonny coming back. He says, "After some of my cousins turned their back on me out there, said if I ever returned to the res, they'd beat my ass. I really had no desire to return." So he's a reluctant hero to return to the reservation, especially without Jordan and Tius there. Okay? He wants his friends, he wants his support, but he feels alone. "I wanted so much to hate Roger, who thought like them, and hate my mom for loving him, and hate the home that squeezed the queer right out of its languages." Okay, so here he is returning home, but he wants to hate everything about his home. So this is the cultural assimilation that he feels, the idea of having the Indian beaten out of him, right? Historically through the residential schools, in his world, although he didn't go to residential school, in this kind of self-loathing, that the Indian is no good, that we shouldn't want to be that, right? And he's like, I hate that, I hate that, I hate that, but I love it at the same time. They're my family, they're my people, right? And just to, point out, that squeezed the queer right out of its languages, that being a, queer brown boy on the res, as he says earlier in the book, right, that's been squeezed out of the language, that the two-spirit identity, the queerness that he experiences, he doesn't even have the linguistic capability of Cree, of his language, to speak who he is, that identity as embodied in the language, as articulated in language, is gone. He mostly speaks English. He doesn't have a lot of Cree at his disposal. He's like, where did that go? Okay, so this is the recuperation that reconciliation is talking about. And so on the final page of the novel, and I'll just point this out, in sort of the last 20 or 30 pages, he really starts to talk a lot about the stories that he both told and heard growing up in different contexts. And it's this return to story, this return to narrative that's, I think, really important in the novel, right? And so this is the final page of the novel. I'll just read it in its entirety, because it's kind of important. The only time an Indian pulls out their photo album is when someone dies. My dad is in ours, so my Kokum and Mush and Roderick, and now so was Roger. Whenever we used to bring it out, my aunties and uncles all gathered around and talked stories. The album was our allowance to remember. So it's the photographic evidence and the stories that go along with it that allow him to remember, to reconcile with the past. Everyone came to see the photos with bannock and stew and dried meat in hand. We ate, we drank, we laughed and cried in unison. Okay, this is the coming together of family. This is the returning home, the fulfillment of the hero's journey. My Kokum had a story for every photo. Stories that redeemed even the alcoholics and the baby daddies. Stories that love and scream in pain in equal measure. It's all there. We're all there. But here, now, it's just us two. We can read this, this is just Jonny and his mother looking at the history. But I think he's also gesturing out of the text here. But here, now, you and me reading this book, it's just us two. It's Jonny, the speaker of this narrative, speaking to the reader, whoever that is, Indigenous, white, etc. And there are blank pages for my mom and me. So he's looking forward into the future history. How are we going to write that? What stories are we going to tell? This is one of them, right? When I look back at these old photos, I see my family come alive. I see their youth, but I also see them aging and dying and living their lives. It's overwhelming to think about all the stories that we've made, helped to tell, helped to create. Our bodies are a library. I said in earlier videos that this book is a lot about the body, but now the body is turned into stories. The story and the body become one. And the body is not just one story, it's a library. And our stories are written like braille on the skin. I wouldn't trade it for the world. I love the noise, the liveliness of voices that are laughing, arguing, bingo calling, and telling the stories in a two-packed home. So it's this idea of abundance, right? Of being in a home that's full of your people, right? The people who are close to you, which the forced adoption agencies and such worked to dismantle, that homes were empty. But now the homes are filling up, and he's imagining, what is this like? In fact, I'd say that's my world. We're all here telling our stories in Indian time. But the ironic thing I've learned about Indian time is that it's an elixir of an excuse and a toxin of a measurement. It will kill you, if you love it too dearly. And that's the truth. Okay? So he ends on this affirmation of story. It's about the stories that we tell. And if you go and look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a lot of what they include in there are the stories of the survivors in their own narrative form, that they don't reduce it to statistics. They don't allow white people to tell the stories. They allow the Indigenous people to tell their own stories as a record of what happened to them. And it's that focus on the importance of stories, and the focus of literature. This is why reading literature of any kind is important, is it's the richness of the stories that allow us to understand the complexities of these situations. And I just love how he ends, and that's the truth. Now, I don't know if he's doing this intentionally or not, but since we've read Thomas King gave a series of Massey lectures called The Truth About Stories. And in all those lectures, he always ends by saying, some of you might say that you've never heard this story, but now I've told it to you, right? And you can't say that you haven't heard it, right? And so when Jonny Appleseed ends with, and that's the truth, I think he's making a kind of, indirect gesture towards Thomas King saying the truth about stories, right? But this is the truth, the story of Jonny Appleseed. So I'll end it there.